Well, good morning. Welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder. This is BRN Sunday for Sunday, May 16th, 2021. We've got another great show for you this week. I'll be joined by members of the media, academia, and financial services as we analyze all the news and information in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, so much more. Glad you could join us. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of BRN Sunday. Well, let's kick things off with a look at personal finance, and there's a lot going on this week, especially. Joining us on the line, she is the personal finance reporter from The Motley Fool, and we know her as Mari Backman. Mari, so great to talk to you this morning. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
No problem, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
A lot going on this week. We had the Colonial Pipeline shut down, but before that led to a lot of inflationary pressure on gas prices. But there's a lot going on with inflation and looking at food prices, the cost of eggs, the cost of going out, getting more expensive. I know you're going to break it down for us. What's your take on all this?
Yeah, so obviously, there's two things happening. Number one is that the economy is slowly but surely reopening. That's a good thing, but it also is driving demand for certain products that may be in short supply. And speaking of supply, thing number two is that there have been some supply chain disruptions that have gone down in the course of the pandemic that are now starting to sort of catch up with us. And you referenced, the gas issue and the pipeline issue. That's a more recent thing, and that's really a temporary thing. Mm-hmm. I know there's a big gas shortage in parts of the Southeast that I think is going to, hopefully resolve for you guys pretty quickly. But the general takeaway here, Jeff, is that the cost of a lot of things has gone up, and it's going up. And, it really runs the gamut. I mean, a lumber shortage that started last year, has now caused a scenario, and I just wrote about this, so I know that this number is accurate. It's caused a scenario where it's driving up the average price of a new construction home by $36,000.
Oh, my Lord.
Which is a lot when you consider the fact that the median home price for, the median sale price for existing homes is a little over $300,000. I think it's somewhere in the ballpark of like 309, 312, something like that, maybe in the 320s. But when you consider that now the average new home being built is costing $36,000 more, that's huge, And obviously a home is a very large, significant purchase, and if you're saving up to buy a home, you're going to have to run those numbers, and there's a lot of planning involved. But what we don't all necessarily plan for are the day-to-day expenses that we just plain incur in order to, exist and function. I mean, I go fill up my car all the time. I buy produce. I buy, even though I'm a vegetarian, I buy chicken, for my family. All of these things are going up. And it's going to start costing people more money. It's already costing people more money.
Yeah, look, this is as you said, a big deal when it comes to kind of reopening the economy. Things haven't really been operating the same way for 14 months, give or take. So ramping up, going to take some time, a little bit of patience, a little bit of that expectation. We're going to be good. You mentioned home prices kind of being slightly or largely inflated because of the lumber issue. Mari, what about cars? I took a tour, not a tour. My wife and I stopped by the local Toyota dealer here in Charlotte, looking to check out cars. They didn't have any cars for us to check out, so we were sitting in an open showroom. They can't get cars. They can't get chips for that power a lot of these cars' smart systems.
Yeah, I mean, there's a chip shortage as well, which is causing, issues with cars, with electronics. I mean, there's a lot going on right now, and I think it's all going to eventually settle down and resolve, right? Mm-hmm. But the car issue is kind of comparable to the housing issue in that there is more demand than there is supply. And then, at least in the housing market, that's definitely driving home prices up to the point where a lot of buyers who would normally be able to purchase a home are just being priced out. And when you think about it, I mean, I think home prices are up something like 16% year over year. I mean, that makes a that makes a big difference. And compounding the issue in the housing market is the fact that the greatest shortage of inventory happens to be on the lower end of the market. That's where you've got your starter homes, maybe your fixer-uppers, your homes that are just less expensive. So, all of this obviously, it makes for a tricky situation. I would definitely encourage the average consumer right about now, as you're going about your spending, you're buying the things you need to function, you're living your daily life, you're kind of getting maybe back toward normal life, which is a great thing. But I definitely recommend start doing like a weekly financial checkup. Kind of look through your bills, look through your credit card statements, look at your grocery bills, see what you've been spending. Because what can happen, Jeff, it's innocent enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, your food bill cost you $20 more this week. Maybe this week you paid an extra $10 at the pump or whatnot. And it's innocent if it happens for a short sprint of time, but if this continues and you're all of a sudden spending an extra 20 here and 30 there and 15 there, and that's happening every week, and it's happening week after week, and you're kind of living paycheck to begin with, that's a scenario that could slowly but surely lead you into debt, and you don't want that. And while obviously the individual consumer can't go and dictate what price he or she pays for chicken or for produce or for anything really, what we can do is kind of take a look at our spending and say, okay, well, these essentials are costing me more now, and that stinks. But as long as that's the situation, I guess I'm going to have to cut back on something that I do have the ability to cut back on. So maybe that's, your discretionary spending. Maybe it's now that the pandemic's over, not over, I shouldn't say over, I want to take that back actually. Now the pandemic is easing up,
Yeah.
and people are starting to get back out, maybe socialize more. All right, it's the time to say to yourself, maybe I'm going to go out a little bit less instead of, going back to meeting friends twice a week. I'm going to do it once a week or not, because otherwise, you're going to have people getting into these situations where this innocent, extra spending, and it's not irresponsible spending. We all have to fill up our tanks, and we all have to buy food. But, when prices go up and our income doesn't go up, we need to adjust for that.
Yeah. You bring up a really good point. And as you were chatting, I was looking at the CPI numbers, the Consumer Price Index numbers that were released Wednesday by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And, I'm not a big fan of CPI. I think it leaves out a lot of things. But it definitely has spiked. And, Mario, we're facing, I feel like we're kind of caught in that Iron Maiden trap, torture device where you turn one way, you get grabbed, you turn the other way, you get grabbed, right? That spiky device. And, the states, I think, have started kind of pulling back on some of the unemployment benefits or the PUA, the pandemic assistance benefits, are shortening some of those time frames. So I think consumers seeing the prices go up, maybe they haven't returned to their jobs yet. We still have some people who are a lot of people who are unemployed in this country. It really makes for a lot of pressure on the average American consumer, and that's not a good thing for financial security and independence. And we all want to feel secure and have our independence.
Yeah, exactly. And the unemployment thing you just touched on, that's a big issue. I think to date, or at least as of late yesterday, there were 11 states that had decided to pull the expanded unemployment benefits early. And, some of these states are citing issues like, local labor shortages and, and lawmakers have been screaming for months that these, boosted unemployment benefits basically deter workers from getting back to a job. That's really a shame, and it's not the whole story because the reality is that a lot of schools still aren't open. They're not even open for full-time in-person learning. So you've got a lot of people on the lower end of the wage spectrum where maybe they're on unemployment and they want to get back to work, but they don't have childcare because they don't have school. And if they were to pay for full-time childcare, they'd come out, with a negative income.
Yeah.
So, it's that the unemployment issue could be a whole other discussion, but and obviously people who are on unemployment are really, that's the true definition right now of a fixed income. You think about retirees being on a fixed income with Social Security and other things. You've got the unemployed people who are in the same exact boat. So everyone really needs to kind of pay attention, to what's being spent, given that, you've got a lot of people on a fixed budget. You've got a lot of people who, yeah, maybe they're working, they're not on unemployment, but heck, they're also on a fixed income when you think about it, right?
Yep.
So I think the takeaway here is just now's a really good time to be careful and be mindful. It's a time where if you normally don't really check your credit card statement until it's the end of the month and you get that notification that your bill is due and your billing statement's available, so that's when you first go and look at it. No, that's not what we're doing now. Now what we all need to be doing is we need to be checking that credit card statement once a week, or maybe every 10 days, or at least every 2 weeks. But now's the time when we all need to be paying attention to how much money is flying out of our wallets.
Yeah, it's a scary time. I think for a lot of people, myself included, having to deal with all these changes, and things are not the same as they were even 6 weeks ago. Mari, we're going to leave it.
It's an awkward time.
It is
It's
awkward.
an awkward time, right, Jeff?
It's change is not easy. We all hate change. I hate change.
And listen to what I just said before, and I really want to reiterate, because I would never want the words "the pandemic is over" to come out of my mouth at a time like this, and that was clearly a slip of the tongue.
Yeah.
But it's true. We're in this very weird transition time where a lot of people have been vaccinated, and it seems like things are opening back up, restrictions are being lifted, and that's a very positive thing. We obviously all want to get back to normal. We just have to make sure that our finances don't take a tumble in the process.
Yeah, well, that we always talk about the annual checkup. I think given these circumstances, it makes much more sense to do it more frequently. Mari, we're going to leave it there, but we're going to catch up with you again in a few weeks, and maybe we'll talk unemployment. I know you'll kind of drive that conversation, whatever you're writing about, talking about with the readers out there of the Motley Fool. Mari Backman, great to talk to you. I can't see you, but great to talk to you, hear you, and look forward to having you back on the program again very soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jeff.
Bye-bye. Welcome back, and now we're going to take a look at what's going on Capitol Hill. And joining us on the line, we've got one half of the Legal Eagles. I'm joined today by Kevin Walsh. He's a principal with Groom Law Group, an employee benefits law firm based in Washington, D.C. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning.
Good morning, Jeff. It's always good to be on the show. Even when we're not in the A block, it's nice to be here.
It is great to have you, and you know what? You're in the B block today, so it's not a downgrade; it's still an upgrade.
That's still pretty good.
Yeah, this is important stuff that we're talking about. We had the Secure, we talked about Secure 2.0, however you want to describe it. Now we're going to talk about the Government Accountability Office, I think, being asked to do a study on target date funds. What can you tell us here, Kev?
Jeff, you are so good and such a great lead-in for listeners, because I was going to go and say, the GAO is exploring TDFs, and just start with a whirlwind of acronyms where no one had any idea what we were talking about. But yeah, so you keyed in on what this week's topic is. It's largely target date funds. What's going on with them, and what the government's thinking about with them. So really, there's kind of two things with target date funds that I want to highlight this week. And the first is really the item you highlighted, which is, that the Government Accountability Office has been asked to explore them. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is there's a provision in Secure 2.0, which may make it easier to develop benchmarks for target date funds. So we'll hit on that briefly at the end. But so the big thing, Jeff, the target date funds are kind of the biggest asset class right now. They're when you default somebody into a plan, when someone just isn't sure what they want to do, it seems as though the go-to move for plan fiduciaries is to put folks who don't want to make decisions in a target date fund. Yep. And why do they use a target date fund? They'll use a target date fund because they're designed to, manage an investment portfolio and kind of match up the risk and reward with, what we would expect the risk and return to be of a typical investor as they age. So that means, Jeff, for someone like you who, you've accumulated so much wealth, you're on the cusp of retirement.
You got it all wrong, my friend. But anyway, go ahead.
You have a very conservative portfolio.
Yeah.
And someone like me, just as this young upstart, they'd put me in a very aggressive portfolio, with the thought being that, you've got to preserve your capital, and I've got to accumulate, just with our different horizons and different, different levels of financial stability. Mm-hmm. So those are the big asset class. That's the big asset class, and this is kind of as a result of moves in the retirement space over the last 10 years. And now Congress is wondering, well, are target date funds working out for the people who are being defaulted into them? And some of why they're being asked this is that there's been some criticism in academic circles in recent years that have said, target date funds, you're really paying two layers of fees. You're paying a fee for allocation, so for figuring out how much Jeff should be allocated to risky assets and conservative assets, for figuring out how much Kevin, where he is, should be allocated to risky assets and conservative assets. But then you're also paying another layer of fees, which is, the allocating in the target date fund is to underlying funds typically. So you're paying a management fee for, the bond funds that I'm invested in, the bond funds that you're primarily invested in. I'm paying not only for allocation, but I'm paying for, the equity funds, maybe the alternative funds that I'm being allocated into. And, then there's also some thought that, could investors be better off if they just allocated directly to those underlying funds? So the GAO is being asked, what's going on with targeted funds? Are people paying too much in fees? This two-layer of fees, is this really a concern? And this is likely to take them, a year, 2 years to really dig into. So I don't think anything's imminent with it, but it's interesting that they're looking at it. And kind of I suspect that, at the end of this, more will be said than done. It's kind of an elegant talking point if you're an academic to say that, a participant may be able to pay less in fees if they allocate directly to a portfolio that matches up with their risk and return profile, and if they rebalance it quarterly or periodically on their own. But realistically, I mean, there's some value for money. Like I don't think I'm a good investor, and I'd rather have somebody else allocate assets for me. And I understand that there's going to be a cost associated with them allocating, as well as a cost of managing those underlying funds. And if we're using this as a default for folks who don't want to pick their own investments or who lack the financial expertise to effectively manage for their risk and return, then there's a pretty compelling argument from my vantage point for saying that folks are getting value by paying for asset allocation as well as for management of those underlying funds. But we'll see where GAO comes out.
Yeah, and I just, from my point of view, this is all good. I think that the target date fund has been around since, I want to say, 1998. So when I first came into the industry and saw an explosion in 2006, and I think it's right and proper for an analysis to be done and for people to ask these questions. And fiduciaries, by the way, probably Kevin, should be asking these questions as well. Is my fund still appropriate? Is it the right? Does it work for my demographic? Because as we all know, the work demographic is changing. People move around a little bit more frequently. So are people leaving their money in plan, out of plan? To me, this is what regulators and legislators and those around the retirement industry should probably be doing. Although the potential clearly is there to upset the apple cart, to use a metaphor.
Well, and I think it's a smart move just in terms of periodically looking at things. I agree with you on that, Jeff, because I think all too frequently we see academics claim there's a problem and then we throw together a solution. When here it seems like what we're doing is we're saying there's a couple of academics who've said there's something going on. Let's explore it before we decide what to do next.
Yeah.
So I think that's a pretty reasonable action by the government to sit back, breathe, get the facts straight, and then move on.
Yeah.
And then the other interesting thing in the target date fund space is that I think we're on the cusp of some innovation there. I mean, I think I've mentioned in other weeks there's been kind of pushes to include like an option to convert to insurance, to an annuity at retirement. There's been a push to make it easier to include more asset classes inside target date funds. So this is an interesting time for the study because I think this is an industry where we could see some disruption in coming years. But pivoting to topic 2, and I'll hit on this real quick because I know you want to get to the C block as quickly as you can. without legal eagle David Levine here, the listeners will only put up with so much of this legal eagle.
Funny.
But so another issue we've seen in the target date fund space has been, and we've seen it in the litigation context where plaintiffs have said, your target date fund Um, it has underperformed compared to some benchmark that the plaintiffs come up with. And the difficulty here has been that benchmarking target date funds has been difficult because every target date fund has a different glide path. Every target date fund has a slightly different asset allocation. So finding a good benchmark for the defendants can be somewhat tough, or finding a meaningful benchmark can be somewhat tough because every target date fund, I mean, since they're different, if you have a different allocation to stock than bond, then you've got a whole different risk return profile. So a benchmark may be kind of meaningless. And in the new Secure Act, in Section 303, there's a provision that would allow for plan fiduciaries to pick a benchmark, which is a blend of market indices, rather than picking one benchmark. And this is attractive because it would essentially allow for comparison of the glide path of a fund to essentially a glide path of indices. And in some ways, this may make it easier to really evaluate how well a target date fund is performing, because you can look at performance against a similar allocation. Now, again, Secure 2.0, we talked about it last week, broad support, but broad support doesn't always mean that legislation passes. But this is a provision to look out for because it could have an impact on how participants can evaluate the performance of their target date funds, how plan fiduciaries can do the same.
Kevin, last question, and you may have addressed this, and if you did, I apologize. I was trying to listen intently. I think I am, and I was. But timing on this study, I think you said it's not going to happen tomorrow. This is going to happen over a period of time. Is it a 12-month period? There's a lot of information to gather here and do studies on, right?
So I mean, if I was ballparking this, if I had to make a market in this, I would say that the study's complete in about 2 years.
Okay. So we'll all be, and then will they, as part of this, typically when a GAO does something like this, do they go out to providers and people to kind of query the marketplace? How does something like this kind of get done typically? Not saying this is going to be what's is going to happen with this study, but do they just go out and look at the market? Sorry.
That's a great question. So GAO will have a team of researchers assigned to this. They'll be looking at market performance. They'll be asking probably target date fund sponsors for facts. They'll talk with plan fiduciaries. They'll talk with government agencies. They will reach out to law firms for that matter. And they'll basically try to figure out as much as they can, talking to as many folks and reading as much as they can to put this together. And it's time consuming. I mean, I've talked with GAO about other topics, and they're typically pretty thoughtful and come in with a whole bunch of questions because they recognize that Congress doesn't ask them to look into things that are obvious on their face.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting to see. This is obviously an important topic. I think it's right and proper to do this. We're over 20 years into this endeavor and of using these funds, and I think it's time for it makes sense to review and evaluate them, and are they appropriate, and what can be done better, because we can always get better and improve our retirement system. Kevin Walsh, he's one half of the Legal Eagles. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning, and we give our best to David Levine. We miss him, but appreciate you coming on in his stead.
Thanks, Jeff. It's always good being on.
Thanks, buddy. Bye-bye. Welcome back, and now we're going to shift gears, talk a little bit about technology, or a lot about technology. Joining us on the line, he is lead advisor, executive producer for Seven Investing. I said that. Let's welcome in Daniel Klein. Dan, so great to talk to you. Sorry for blowing your intro, but people know you.
No problem, Jeff. My plan was to talk sports this morning, but if you want to talk technology, we can do that.
Okay, well, I'm happy to talk about the Red Sox or the Pats if you want to talk about either. But let's start with the chip and the chip shortage and what that means for the cost of tech items, Dan.
So we're going to have a short-term squeeze on a lot of items, a lot of things we buy. Here's what happened. During the pandemic, our demand shifted. In the early days of the pandemic, we had kids home from school, we were watching more TV, so we replaced our laptops, we bought new televisions. We weren't buying cars. So manufacturers went, well, let's not make chips for cars. Let's make the lower end chips for TVs and laptops and computers. Over the past few months, there's a shortage of cars. There's actually about a 33-day inventory of cars when there's normally about a 90-day inventory.
Mm.
It's 88 technically, but that so there's a very constrained supply chain. And why does that matter? Well, in the short term, if your laptop breaks and you need a new one, it's probably going to cost you more money. If you have to replace your car, it's definitely going to cost you more money. And you're going to read a lot of places that this is inflation, that prices are going up. And the reality is, while there might be inflation on certain things, there's a demand inequity. And I'll give you an example. I've used this on some of our shows. May is not a giant month for tourism in Orlando. But because the pandemic has let up, it has been a pretty much sell-out month at resort properties. Disney World is booked up at such capacity as it has. Other places are pretty much full. So the Target near me that has a tourist section does not have as many towels as they usually have, because tourists come and they buy $3.99 towels. Why is that? Because Target's normal inventory supply says gear up with towels in June when the summer starts, not gear up in May. So you're going to have a lot of things where usage patterns are just totally different, and companies were left sort of, having to manage their supply chain and not having what they need. Back when I ran a retail store, we would plan out our Christmas purchases in the summer. Some of our purchases, like Legos, had to be planned out a year in advance. That's because they're manufacturing based on demand. Well, right now, demand has gotten all hinky. We don't really know when people are going to need stuff, at what times. And we've talked about this before, Jeff. I'll just point you to Starbucks. Previously, Starbucks was busy from like 7 to 9 because that's when people are going to work. Now you might show up at Starbucks at 1 and there's a long line because we're not going to work. Patterns are really strange. So this isn't necessarily demand driving up prices. This is lack of supply because there was no way to forecast these needs. The demands for cars came back way faster. The demand for TVs was strong in the beginning. It's gone down, and now there's not as much supply. So if you need one, you're going to pay more. But it's not as easy as it's being portrayed in the media.
Yeah. Dan, let's talk about Amazon Prime Day, which I think in some places, I think particularly in India, has been delayed for obvious reasons, pandemic, disruption, yada, yada, yada. When is Amazon Prime Day, and can we expect to be able to get some of these electronic goods? That I think I sent you an article that the price of televisions going through the roof. Remember, the cost was going down around Christmas time and the holidays. And traditionally, as you get better technology, newer technology replaces old technology, the price goes down of existing technology. But let's start with Amazon Prime Day. When do you see that thing starting?
So I don't see them doing it in the traditional July slot. Why is that? You could call Amazon Prime Day Amazon Clearance Day. Because while, yes, some manufacturers offer specials and bring out merchandise just for Prime Day, a lot of the stuff that sells on Prime Day is just Amazon going like, geez, what do we own that didn't sell? Let's make it an event. And look, most retailers did this. I used to do this at the toy store too. We would just clean out the back storage area and have like a garage sale kind of day. I once sold 500 Darth Maul umbrellas for $5 a piece that I'm not entirely sure how we acquired. So, I don't think Amazon has that inventory because during the pandemic, they largely focused on needed items. So obviously Amazon, really in the early days, they stopped stocking things like weights and exercise equipment. They've gotten back to that, but I don't think they have that backlog of like, oh, wow, like people really liked this treadmill. They didn't really like that one. So let's sell that one and just get our money back. I don't think that's going to happen. I think you might see Prime Day in the fall. That will probably make more sense. I also think you're going to see a very strange holiday season. If you remember last holiday season, Jeff, it was a wonderful time to buy a television. I bought a 65-inch television for
The Super
under
Bowl?
$300.
For the Super Bowl.
Yeah, or for I'm not even sure what, just to have. And my neighbors bought a different one at a different time at a similar low price. I think you're going to see a much smaller amount of super discounted items. So, with an ongoing supply shortage of chips and other pieces needed to make these devices, you might see a manufacturer that might have had 10 models just for the holiday at good discounts. They might just have one big discount model. So you might see a lot less selection. This is just me guessing, but these kinds of supply chain issues don't settle themselves in 6 months. This might take a year. The other thing is if you're a store, you don't know exactly what to stock. Like if you're, a clothing store, are you betting on a return to work in the fall? Like what percentage is going to go back to an office? 50%, 60%, 80%? We don't know these answers. So everything is going to be kind of order on demand, and that keeps prices high. And I would expect prices to generally be higher, but that's not necessarily a long-term reflection of where prices will go.
Yeah, this is, I guess, what you would describe generically as supply chain, right? This is all about the supply chain ramping things back up. Seeing, people are not going to just produce televisions or electronic goods until they know for a fact that people are going to be buying them. And there's still some uncertainty in terms of the pandemic in parts of the world, but also uncertainty in terms of what people are going to be willing to buy and what the economy is going to look like. So I guess more to come on this. This will be a work in progress. I think this is just indicative of what a reopening here in America and elsewhere looks like.
Yeah, let me just give a final thought here. So, like, I bought multiple computers last year. Means I probably don't need a computer next year. I'm not entirely sure how Apple or Amazon or Best Buy plans for that because maybe I bought one this year, but I used it so much more, I wore it into the ground and I'm going to want a new one. So, usually you predict inventory based on past results. So, okay, last Christmas we sold 300 Christmas tree puzzles. This Christmas, our sales are 5% better. I'll order 315 Christmas tree puzzles. That's logic. This year, maybe we all bought all the puzzles we're ever going to want to do during the pandemic. It becomes really tricky to predict these things.
Yeah, let's shift gears, Dan, excuse me, and let's talk about, education, children's education. Franchises now, children education franchises are going high tech. So I think that's an interesting trend. And does that kind of match what the kids experience with virtual schooling and accessing it through your tablet? And what does this overall mean?
So it's about time. So I spent a lot of years consulting in the education space. My wife was the editor of a website called educationworld.com, and I was a consultant there. That's eventually why she got hired. So I've talked with a lot of teachers, and education is generally resistant to change. So if we had a model where your after school math tutoring program was I drop you off at the math tutoring place and you have your tutoring and then I pick you up, a model that makes sense for little kids, but it doesn't necessarily make sense for a 17-year-old. Maybe a 17-year-old could have done that digitally. There was a lot of resistance to that change. And we saw this in the schools. When they had to go to a distance learning model, they weren't ready to do that. The first quarter my son was in a distance learning, it was a lot of like, teacher puts assignment in a folder, you're supposed to do it, none of the technology worked. It took about a semester for it to get like somewhat okay. And it's because in those worlds, technology that to you and me, Jeff, is basic, like Zoom or Skype or whatever, or Google Meet or whatever they call it now. Those were not common. Those
Sorry.
always should have been part of the school. Like, so let's say my son wakes up and he has the sniffles, and I don't want to send him to school because he might be sick. Why 2 years ago couldn't he zoom into his classroom? That technology is easy and cheap. Um, that said, so that's now all in place. And we're seeing that with after school programs. Now, obviously, some aspect of after school programs isn't just education, it's also childcare. But in this day and age where parents have to be home and they don't necessarily want their kids going someplace, or in some cases, they're not allowed to take their kids places, you're seeing most of these programs switch to the ability to have online classes and building out tools where they can do it. I worked a decade ago on at-home ability to take a music lesson, where one of the biggest problems in the music lesson industry is if you reschedule, generally you've paid for 10 lessons and you reschedule, and the teacher doesn't get that money until they have the class. One of the ways around that would be to say, okay, if you can't come at our prearranged time Thursday at 3:30, I, the teacher, am still going to do the lesson. I'm going to put it into this web page, and I'm available to answer 3 follow-up questions. Well, there was incredible resistance to that from the stores where music lessons are taught. The teachers loved it, the stores didn't. I think now you're going to see much more hybrid, the ability to have these things remote when necessary,
Hmm.
in person when possible. And this sort of jump-started a bunch of technology. We were already seeing things like tutoring be much more possible online. And now I think it's going to be sort of de facto the norm. Where sure, you want to take your kid to Mathnasium or Sylvan Learning Center or whatever it is, but when they can't or when the teacher's unavailable and you can do it at home or digitally, they're going to have the ways to track that, to connect the sort of added pieces of it that maybe are necessary to share materials, to keep it safe and secure. We're seeing all of that being built on the fly, and that's only going to get better over the next couple of years.
So, how will, let me ask you this. This is kind of a tricky question, but let's tackle it anyway. What does this mean in terms of the quality of education? Because that quality of education, I think, if you talk to a lot of parents, went down. But in terms of being able to provide a quality education experience, invest heavily into doing that, and greater adoption by school districts, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the school districts have to adopt it in order to make it widespread.
Yeah, so I think it's a mixed bag. Quality of education went down because, at least in the beginning, there were a couple of factors working against you. One, the tools weren't good. My son's school was working with Google Classroom. It wasn't live broadcast, it just wasn't good. And then, once you got the live broadcast component, guess what most teachers aren't? They're not entertainers, and there's a big difference from teaching in a classroom. And you know this. You know what we're doing now is a performance in a sense.
It's fine art, is the way I describe it.
Yeah, there's a big difference between knowing something and being entertaining talking about it. So I think that was a challenge. But then there's another factor in this. So in the old days, let's say, you were a kid, I don't know, getting cancer treatments and you couldn't come to school. The way we dealt with that was like your friend dropped off a book with some homework assignments. Now, it'll be really easy for any classroom to say, okay, I'm just going to turn on the Zoom cameras. And when you're able to attend. When you're able to participate. That's a much better experience on a one-on-one level with, tools like Zoom being out there and being, free for basic use.
Mm-hmm.
My son, had a one-on-one algebra tutor for much of his algebra class. And then when we went to the pandemic and he had to finish up some stuff, I had my colleague who used to be a math teacher jump on with him and do some algebra tutoring. So his world for who he can get algebra tutoring from is much bigger. Your ability to go online and get an inexpensive, excellent tutor is way stronger in many markets than your ability to get an in-person tutor. And I'm not against in-person tutoring. I loved his in-person algebra tutor. But I live in a busy metropolitan area. If you live in a small town, there may not be as many choices, or they may be very expensive. So your ability to go get tutored in any subject from, say, a smart college kid, and it's $20 an hour instead of $60 an hour, that is, I think, a big advancement. So technology doesn't solve all problems. I highly would argue against fully remote learning as being as effective as a hybrid or fully in-person, but it's a wonderful tool to have in your tool belt.
Yep, no more snow days, kids. There are not going to be any more snow days, sick days.
That's actually a big benefit though, because as much as snow days are fun when you're a kid, they make them up at the end of the year.
Yeah.
And you know what's terrible, especially here in Florida, when it's like June 20th and you're still in school and it's 210 degrees outside.
Wait a minute, they have snow days in South Florida?
We have hurricane days.
Oh, okay. Well, my bad. Yeah, I wasn't really thinking. Dan Klein, it is always a pleasure. Really, we talked about a lot of different things. Really good. Appreciate having you on the program, and we'll look forward to catching up with you again next week.
I'll see you next week.
Bye, Dan. Welcome back. Now we're going to check in on travel. Yes, I said travel. Joining me now to discuss this and a lot more is Jacob Passy. He's Market Watch's intrepid real estate and also travel reporter. Jacob, thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning.
Glad to be here.
So vaccinations, I think, picking up. Over 100 million Americans vaccinated, and we're approaching Memorial Day, which typically is a high travel time. Americans get out on the road, and I got to think that looking at some AAA numbers, that we're going to see increased numbers this Memorial Day. But I know you've got some tips to avoid some of the increases potentially in travel prices.
Totally. Yeah, you put it perfectly just now. The research out there suggests that travel this summer is going to be in excess of the levels we saw in 2019 before the pandemic. People are calling it revenge travel, but basically, all this pent up demand that's been happening over the past year. So many people had to cancel trips because of COVID, and like you said, everyone's getting vaccinated right now, hopefully. And if you haven't, you should, do so, because it certainly opens up a lot of possibilities. We saw the CDC saying this week that if you've been vaccinated, you can live your life like normal, don't have to worry about masks, etc. So I think lots of people are ready to hit the road or skies or water, however they're going to travel. And yeah, prices are increasing. The most recent report for the Consumer Price Index, which came out, this past week, showed that airfares had risen by a record amount on a monthly basis between March and April, and that's only going to continue. So, it's important to, start thinking about this now. If you're planning a travel this summer, don't put off the planning and the reservations and all that, because demand is sky high, but supply is limited. Their airlines are still recovering. They're still working to bring planes back online. A lot of airlines basically grounded their jets during the pandemic to reduce their costs, and they cost a lot of money to get those back up and running. So for the time being, even airlines are going to be slowly reintroducing more and more itineraries every day. But there's only so many seats on a plane to go around, so that's an issue. If you've tried to book a rental car this summer, you've probably encountered what folks are deeming rental carmageddon. Basically, there are so many people looking to take road trips and book those with rental cars that it's, in some parts of the country, out of major airports, it's practically impossible to find a reservation right now. And that all means, high prices. So yeah, so I spoke with travel experts and financial experts to, collect some pieces and nuggets of advice on how you can save money and what you need to be thinking about as you're booking your summer travel.
Jacob, you mentioned some increased prices due to Carmageddon and some other people getting back on the road in excess of the 2019 numbers. What about these gas prices that, I live in North Carolina, as you know, and we I think 75% of our gas is still, of our gas stations are still out of gas. But how much of this is attributable to gas prices? How much of this is attributed to just the inflation that we're seeing in other aspects of the economy, and how much of it is supply chain related, meaning supply chain related that you were talking about, kind of getting the airplanes back up and running, et cetera?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of all those factors. I mean, the situation with gas prices this past the past week or so, because of the Colonial Pipeline, that is, going to be a short-term thing. Once that, I think that they are back up and running, or are starting to be back up and running with that pipeline. And so, the shortages of gas that we're seeing, across the East Coast, those will be somewhat short-lived. Once that pipeline is up and running again, then, gas stations will be able to get gas again. And so that will cause there to be a bit of a reduction in gas prices, certainly. But, it is worth mentioning that they hit $3 on average nationwide for the first time in many years as a result of that situation. And, with so many people planning road trips and other forms of travel, gas prices don't just affect, cars, folks traveling by car. It also affects flights. It affects the price of airfare, because, airlines have to factor in the cost of their jet fuel. It affects, if you're traveling by bus, those run on gas, and that will cause bus prices potentially to go up. So it will cause, that is a factor for sure. But it's also all this demand. There's just so many people are going to be traveling that is just going to increase the need for those resources and the prices of them. If you are looking to book a rental car, a flight, anything like that this summer, book sooner rather than later. Memorial Day is right around the corner, and that's, kind of the unofficial start of the summer season, in a way. And, if you wait until after, the closer you wait to book something, you might think, well, I'll find a last minute deal. First of all, there's so many people traveling this summer that I don't know that people are going to be offering those But even if they are, you're making you're making a huge bet that there will be better deals along the way. The sooner you start looking at prices and planning out your trip, the better off you will be if because you're giving yourself more room to study how the prices are fluctuating and kind of know what is actually a good price. So don't hold off on booking. The other thing to keep in mind if you're nervous about booking is a lot of travel operators are still keeping their COVID friendly policies in place in terms of waiving the cancellation and change fees. So airlines, for instance, you can still generally find airfares where you can change the flight information, change when you're leaving or what have you, further down the road. And you won't have to pay a change fee. You'll only be responsible for the difference in the fare. So I booked summer travel this summer, and I was not 100% sure of the dates I booked, but I made sure that I booked with an airline that was still offering that policy. So I have that peace of mind that if further down the road, if I'm get nervous about traveling because maybe COVID cases are rising again, or if my circumstances change and it's just not going to work out for those dates, I have that peace of mind that I can change my trip pretty easily and won't be forking over tons of money in change fees. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to ask you, Jacob, what about travel insurance? Oftentimes if I'm on a website for airfare, they'll ask me if I want to get travel insurance. I mean, is that a necessity given the flexibility that a lot of airlines are going to be with or are right now with change dates?
Yeah, so travel insurance, it's a tricky question in a lot of ways. And a few things to keep in mind. First of all, if you're booking with a credit card, a lot of credit cards do offer some form of travel insurance to their cardholders. So, check what that policy is in advance. Maybe it is enough protection for you, and that might be all you need. But then, if you get offered, like you just said, a lot of travel providers will offer their own insurance policy to you. But read the fine print on that before you get it. Oftentimes there are clauses where they will not cover the situation if it's due to foreseen circumstances. And so if you end up having to cancel for a reason related to COVID, well, the pandemic's been going on a year now, and it might be going on many years from now. We don't know how long it's going to last. So they could argue that you could have foreseen that COVID was going to be a situation and decline to cover it. So instead, what you might want to seek out is a cancel for any reason policy, and you might need to book that separately. Those policies are, pretty flexible. They, will basically allow you to be covered for, if any sort of change in plans for any reason. Sometimes, though, again, word of warning, they sometimes have, policies in place with those, specific types of insurance that you have to, cancel your trip within 2 days of booking to, get the full amount back. And that can be tough because, one thing that a lot of people might be thinking about is, well, I'm flying to, if you're flying to Hawaii right now, you need to have a COVID test, a negative COVID test to be able to enter the island and not quarantine. But let's say things get screwed up and, the day of your trip, the company you got your test from said, oh, it's going to take us another couple days to get the result back to you. Well, then you may not be able to even go on your trip. But if you have a cancel for any reason policy that says you had to cancel 3 days in advance, not simply the day of, then that policy is not going to do you much good. So keep that all in mind. Also, those policies are more expensive, but conversely, it might be worth spending money on. And that's one thing I brought up in this story I did is there are instances right now where spending more money could actually save you in the long run. So going back to the example of the free flight changes that a lot of airlines are offering, in most cases, those apply to main economy class and higher. But a lot of airlines are now offering something called basic economy, where it's, you're sitting in the back of the plane with the rest of the economy class folks, but you don't get to choose your seat in advance and all these other things. It's a cheaper fare than main economy. But in many cases, the free flight changes do not apply to basic economy. So you first of all want to review whether that's the case. But if it is the case, it might be worth spending that extra, $30, $50, however much it is, to do main economy, because not only do you get, lots of other benefits, choosing your seats in advance. Sometimes you get, a piece of luggage that you might not get with basic economy. But on top of that, you will be able to change your flight for free and not have to worry about losing all that money on that ticket. So, there are definitely times where pinching pennies are not worth it. And, during a pandemic, that's probably one of them.
Yeah, well, good advice. And I guess we should also add, you should definitely, in terms of that planning, be checking the CDC website and be checking that particular state's or city's guidelines to make sure that you do what you were discussing with Hawaii and being aware of having to have a test before you get on a plane and land. Jacob, we're going to have to leave it there. I hope that we, given the circumstances, we have some more chats about travel, and we look forward, of course, to having you back on the program again next week.
Talk soon.
Bye-bye. And that wraps up this episode of BRN Sunday. Have a topic of interest, someone you think we should talk to, drop us a line. And don't forget, for all the information in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, so much more, all in one place, check out today's edition of our daily newsletter, The Morning Pulse. We're back again tomorrow for another episode of BRN AM. Until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.